Hi guys, so I'm Sriram and Panchal. We both are going to be presenting to you the infratemporal and retromandibular space. And this video is going to be organized with the locations and borders of the infratemporal space discussed, then its connections to the surrounding structures, then the content of the retromandibular space and the infratemporal space, followed by important anatomical details you must know for your exam. Now, let's discuss the infratemporal space. So this space is a deep region in the face, infratemporal fossa. The fossa is formed by the temporal fossa being separated by the zygomatic arch into the supratemporal and infratemporal fossa. So its borders are, the roof is the greater wings of the sphenoid, the medial wall is the medial plate of the pterygoid process, the lateral wall is the ramus of the mandible, the posterior wall is the styloid septum and muscles, and the anterior wall is the maxillary tuberosity. Now, I'd like to show you this picture. I'm going to bring it up close to you. Now, the anterior wall is the maxillary tuberosity. You can also see the roof, which is the large wings of the sphenoid, and you could imagine the styloid septum and muscles around the styloid process.
Okay, so the next one are the connections. So the connections include the connections anteriorly are with the orbit with the infraorbital fissure. Connections inferiorly are with the submandibular space. Connections medially are with the pterygopalatine fossa, and connections cranially are with the foramen spinosum and foramen ovale. Foramen ovale consists of the mandibular nerve. Foramen spinosum consists of the middle meningeal artery. Next topic, so we finished the location borders, we finished the connections. Next one is the content of the retromandibular space. Now it's very easy, it's the retromandibular vein. And the retromandibular vein is formed by the draining of the superficial temporal vein and the maxillary vein, which drain to form the retromandibular vein. The retromandibular vein itself with the facial vein drain to form the internal jugular vein. And the next topic is the content of the infratemporal space. Now there are three main contents we're going to discuss. There's the mandibular nerve and its branches, and the otic ganglia, and the maxillary artery and its branches. So we're going to start with the mandibular nerve.
So you have this diagram in the file that's sent to you, and I'm just going to do it again with you guys. So to draw the mandibular nerve, let's begin with the trigeminal ganglion. It gives off three branches: the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve enters the infratemporal space through the foramen ovale, and the branches are the masticatory nerve, the lingual nerve, the inferior alveolar nerve, and the auriculotemporal nerve. And before I continue, I'd like to mention that the mandibular nerve is a mixed nerve. This means that it contains afferent and efferent fibers. So it carries sensory fibers carrying information from the periphery to the center, and it also contains motor fibers that innervate the masticatory muscles and other muscles that we will be mentioning later on. So the lingual nerve has the chorda tympani joining at a sharp angle, and the lingual nerve innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and it also contains the branches for the submandibular ganglion. The inferior alveolar nerve gives off a mylohyoid nerve, which innervates the mylohyoid and the anterior belly of digastric, and then enters the mandibular foramen with the inferior alveolar artery. The inferior alveolar nerve then gives rise to the inferior dental plexus, which innervates the teeth, and then continues to enter through the mental foramen to give rise to the mental nerve, which innervates the mental region. And now we have the auriculotemporal nerve, which produces this loop around the middle meningeal artery. And that's all, guys.
Okay, so Sriram discussed the sensory innervations of the mandibular nerve and also one of the motor innervation, which is the nerve to mylohyoid. There are more innervations to other muscles. So there are four main categories. The first one is the masticatory muscles. So this includes the temporalis, the masseter, the lateral and medial pterygoid. The second category is the mylohyoid muscles and the anterior belly of digastric. The third one is the pharyngeal muscles. So pharyngeal muscles include the tensor velli palatini, and the fourth one is the inner ear muscles, which is the tensor tympani.
There's an important thing to mention. So the question is the buccinator muscle innervated by the buccal branch of the facial nerve or by the buccal nerve? So the buccal nerve is not shown in this diagram, but it's deep seated in the face. Let me show you a diagram here. So this is a superficial image of the face. You could see the parotid gland, and you could also see the muscular branches from the facial nerve. And the buccal branch is the one that innervates the buccinator muscle, whereas the buccal nerve, as shown here, is deeply located in the face and only provides sensory innervation for the buccal mucosa.
Okay, so Sriram discussed the important point related to the mandibular nerve as well. So now we're going to move on to the next one, which is the otic ganglia. Now before I move on to the otic ganglia, I'm going to show you a general schema of a parasympathetic ganglia. Okay, so it consists of three fibers. Sensory fibers that move from the periphery to the center. The sympathetic fibers move from the center to the periphery. And parasympathetic fibers which move from the center to the periphery. Parasympathetic fibers synapse in the parasympathetic ganglia. Now there are four parasympathetic ganglia in the head. There is the ciliary ganglia in the orbit. There is the pterygopalatine ganglia in the pterygopalatine fossa. There is the submandibular ganglia in the submandibular space, and then the last one, which is the otic ganglia. This is present below the foramen ovale and medially to the mandibular nerve. And now again, using the schema, we're going to discuss what are the different fibers and where they arise from. So again, there will be the sensory fiber. Now the sensory fiber arise from the communicating branches of the auriculotemporal nerve. So, and they later on join to form the mandibular nerve. The next one, which is the sympathetic fibers. Now the sympathetic fibers arise from the inferior cervical chain, and now these fibers, what they do is they form a plexus around the artery. So they form a plexus around the carotid, common carotid. The plexus continues with the external carotid and then continue maxillary artery. From the maxillary artery, it continues to the middle meningeal artery, and from the middle meningeal artery, they branch off or they come off and they go through the otic ganglia, and then they innervate the parotid gland and the buccal mucosa gland. The last one, which is the parasympathetic fibers. Now the parasympathetic fibers arise from the inferior salivatory nucleus. They join the glossopharyngeal nerve. They move along the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then they follow the tympanic nerve. Tympanic nerve forms the plexus, and from the plexus it gives. I have a diagram that I can show you. The parasympathetic. So for the parasympathetic fibers, they arise from the inferior salivatory nucleus. They go along the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then they go along the tympanic branch, and then they form the tympanic nerve forms a plexus, gives rise to the lesser petrosal nerve. The lesser petrosal nerve goes to otic ganglia synapses, and the postsynaptic fibers hitchhike along the auriculotemporal nerve, and then they go and innervate the parotid gland and the buccal mucosal glands. So synapse. So this would be the lesser petrosal nerve. They will come synapse and they will innervate the parotid gland and the buccal mucosal gland. So now Sriram is going to come and talk about the maxillary artery and its branches.
So the maxillary artery has three parts, and we'll be discussing about the retromandibular and the infratemporal part. The retromandibular part gives off the anterior tympanic, the deep auricular, the middle meningeal, the accessory meningeal, and the inferior alveolar arteries. The infratemporal part gives rise to arterial branches that provide blood supply to the muscles. So there's the deep temporal branches, there is the mesenteric artery, there is the pterygoid branch, and then there is the buccal branch.